Carlton King, former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, but actually looks at geopolitics in the round. Today's episode is part 2 of an episode that I started last week. This episode last week dealt with the question of who is a terrorist, what is terrorism, and why do we, general members of the public, get fed who a terrorist is, and why the vast majority of us tend not to make our own minds up as to what we think a terrorist actually is. Without any further ado, let's listen to part 2. You want to jump across to the Ukraine? You can do exactly the same. As I explained to you, the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union during the Second World War and all the way up to the 1990s. As we know, when the Soviet Union fell. Well, what is less known is that during the Second World War, where the Soviets lost round about, some people say 25, 26, some people say 30, some have even said as high as 45 million citizens. Okay, taking into account that Britain lost 450,000 citizens, men, women, soldiers. 450,000 through 6 years of war. Okay, through 5 years of war, 4.5, the Soviet Union lost between 25 million, not 1,000 now, 25 million and 40 million men, women, soldiers. And by the way, women fought as soldiers in the Soviet Union. So they were soldiers, children. Exterminated. You know, just the same as in the Jewish Holocaust, exterminated. Some of them were Jews, some of them were not. You didn't need to be Jewish, you just needed to be a Soviet. You just needed to be a communist, because actually Hitler hated communists as much as he hated Jews. Same way he hated what Germans call Zigeuner, gypsies. Same way as he hated gypsies. All these people were exterminated. So what I'm saying to you is that when these people fight for freedom, these people, because these were areas taken by the German army. So the German army by 1941 into 42 had taken the whole of Western Soviet Union all the way nigh on to Moscow. Controlled it under its area, put up proclamations, worked with some of the locals, as in the Ukraine example. Many Ukrainians from the Western Ukraine, who happen to be Catholics rather than Orthodox, as a general rule. Some Orthodox are in as well, but happen to be the Catholic Ukrainian, the Western Ukraine, rather than the Eastern Ukraine happen to be generally Orthodox Russian Church. But the Catholic Church joined in with the German armies and formed an organisation called Gleitzen SS. And that organisation was an organisation that went in under now what is German territory and sought out partisans, same as the Machi or the Free French Fighting partisans, and they were all said that they were terrorists. All of them were terrorists. So they went out and murdered all the terrorists. And in fact, the Ukrainian units, which led a lot of this with the German SS, the Ukrainian SS, they basically used to set whole villages on fire, throw babies in, women, etc., murder them all. Okay? Which is why Putin today talks about Nazis when he talks about Ukraine. So, again, terrorist, freedom fighter, question. What I'm trying to do is to give you an understanding of why it's quite difficult to answer the question, is that person a terrorist? As I said to you, Bin Laden's activities were quite simple. It's a belief in what he thinks is the correct God on earth and the way things function. Now, his argument, people say, well, why is he attacking us? Well, his argument was quite simple. If you read the first fatwa, which of course part of my job was to do that and understand him, read the first fatwa, he basically says, you aided me to go to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. Right. And this is where politics can never be lost from all of this. You aided me to go to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. I fought the Soviets with the Mujahideen, who you said were brave freedom fighters, not terrorists, note. Now, again, let's look at, and we need to do this, let's look at the Soviet Union and let's look at their actions in Afghanistan. So when the Soviet Union came into Afghanistan, they were asked to come into Afghanistan by the Afghan government of General Najibullah. So, in other words, they didn't invade into Afghanistan. They went into Afghanistan at the support of the government. Now, originally they were asked in by the support of the government to support the government, and they didn't. And the president of the government was assassinated. So they only went in when the government was taken over by an extreme communist who started killing everybody. And they thought, this looks bad on communism. And of course, an individual who was in the military, who was going to take over Afghanistan and run it, Najibullah, said, come in and support us. So they came in under support. Now, obviously, I'm just paraphrasing. You can look that up properly and you can see how that's really done. There's movements backwards and forwards, and there's a request from the Afghans 2 years earlier to come in and help. The Politburo of the Soviets say no, etc., etc., etc. But I'm not going to go through that history. But you look at it. I've just given you a feel of the history. So this is not an invasion. Now, we spin it as an invasion, and we say we won't be in the Olympic Games because Russia, read Russia for the Soviet Union. It's not Russia, it's the Soviet Union has invaded Afghanistan. It's not an invasion. It's as much an invasion as the United States coming into Vietnam, which the United States went into Vietnam at the behest and assistance of the South Vietnamese government. And that's exactly the same way as was done with the Soviets. Now, both of them have gone in for their own reasons. One is to uphold the systems in the region. So this is the worldwide battle that was going on between communism and capitalism, or socialism and capitalism. So the reality is, is that you can already see how the media, which is, I mentioned the media right in the beginning, how the media plays into what we think about what's going on, hence the critical thinking about who is a terrorist and who isn't. So we've now got to the situation where we've looked at several different conflicts, and we've looked at who is the terrorist and who isn't, and how do we perceive who's a terrorist and who isn't, and why does our government... Because what I should say is the perspective of individuals generally, and Piers Morgan in particular, as to why somebody's a terrorist, is that our country has deemed the organisation terrorist. So that's the perception. So if our country says somebody's a terrorist, then they are. Well, again, you've got to question that process. And sorry, I should just, because I'm jumping around a little bit, I should just finish on Bin Laden, because what I didn't say he knew about the Twin Towers were a pinprick, but he knew that pinprick would be something that made the elephant go crazy. And he knew that in going crazy, that what would happen is they would attack a whole host of countries, and that they would then get new recruits to the cause, because other people would see what the United States does to people who don't toe the line with them. Right? Because when Bin Laden said, "You brought me to Afghanistan to carry out actions against the Soviets as part of the Mujahideen, and you said you were brave freedom fighters," you swore that you would never come into Saudi Arabia. Now, what the Americans did when Kuwait was occupied, which used to be a province, by the way, of Iraq, when it was occupied by the Iraqis, what the Americans did, the first thing they did, they shored up Saudi Arabia and put 500,000 troops in Saudi. Because that was the initial intention, because Saudi could have toppled. And at that stage, most of the oil coming to the United States came out of Saudi Arabia and the region. So they wanted to make sure that it would never fall into the hands of people who could then destroy the economy of the United States because they couldn't get oil. So therefore, what happened was, that was a great move to be able to put into Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden saw through this, saw that, and said, "You've lied and you've put troops into the holiest part of Islam, and now you've got to pay for it." And that's and read the actual fatwa. He says it in a different way. He talks about the 7 pillars and all this sort of business. Read it through, and you'll see what I mean. But basically, what he's saying is you lied, and now you're going to pay the price for it. And the price will be, because we now see through you. You said you were of the book. Now, what you need to understand in my field, when you're dealing with so-called terrorism and fighting it and understand it, you really need to understand the concepts of people. This is why I'm going to talk about Libya later on. You need to understand the concepts of people who are part of what you're fighting. So in Islam, they call it people of the book. And the people of the book are Jews, Islamic people, and Christians. They are of the book, okay? One single book, which was the original book being Judaism, right? And then morphing into Christianity, and then the last prophet being Muhammad. And that being then Islam. Right. So what they're saying is, these people are all from the same book, and if you're of the book, then you're positive. You cannot be a kitab, as they call it. You cannot not be positive. Okay, this is why, in Palestine example, all peoples lived together at one stage. You know, during the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire ran Palestine, okay, until we got the mandate after, well, actually during 1917, but afterwards the mandate was given to us fully. In 1917, we take over from the Ottomans. Those of you who know Lawrence of Arabia will understand this. We took over from the Ottomans, and we take over that area, and we, the British, that is, and basically then the Balfour Declaration is signed subsequently about a place for the Jewish people to live. So it's nothing to do with the Second World War and the Holocaust. This is the Zionist arrangement was made before the Second World War. It was made in 1917. Approximately at that time, there's about 1% to 3% Jewish people in what was then Palestine. But they lived hand in glove, totally together with the Islamic people and with the Christians. Right? They lived together, not a problem. Right? It's the later stages that you're going to have to look to the Nakba and things like that. But you look that up, we're talking about terrorism right now. So what I'm saying is that was it a terrorist act to perceive the fact that somebody entered Saudi Arabia as they saw it, and then to fight back? I would say it was. But would other people, would the religious person say, hang on, what's this bloke doing in the land, these people doing in the land that they shouldn't be in, and taking some control over that land? Now, I find that extreme because I'm not a religious kind of person, so I find it extreme. But will other people find it extreme? This is your problem with terrorism. So what Bin Laden wanted to do was to give the Islamic people no choice. And the way you do that is to show people dying. The way you do that in the countries in which they're living in, especially if they're living in the West, where people look down on people who are Islamic and look at them in a fashion that, are they going to carry a bomb and put a bomb on a train? Are they going to do it? Make people feel uncomfortable the whole time. And in making them feel uncomfortable, making them feel as they don't belong, that moment you can then start bringing in and getting your recruits to the cause, because they then no longer belong as they perceive it. And this is the fear for all peoples who want to control systems. What you don't want is people to belong to a system that isn't yours or you perceive as yours. So for people who are Islamic, of the faith of Islam or the faith of Judaism or the faith of Christianity or the faith of Buddhism or whatever it might be, if your country's run on that perspective, you don't want them to belong to the other faith, because that takes away from you. And by taking away from you and your faith, you're undermining your base. So what you want to do is drag these people back into your faith. And one of the best ways to do that is to have the people amongst whom they are living look at them negatively and cause trouble and strife. And for your people then to fear that those people looking at them may do them some physical harm. And that's what Bin Laden knew he was creating. He was creating a situation whereby he knew that the United States would carry out actions in such a manner that every Muslim would feel a threat from the United States. Okay? And read for the United States the West, because there's no differentiation. It's just the West. So that is what he knew. And that was why my argument was, do not make this attack. Carry out a normal police action, which we've been doing, which is investigating, looking, spying, trying to find out who might be involved in the organisation, and then taking these people down, bringing them into courts. And that's the best way, bringing them into courts in the end. Have special forces bring them through. Me as the intelligence body, let me capture them, have the special forces bring them into a court, not put them in some bloody island in Cuba and leave them there. That's no good. That's just as negative. Bring them into a court, let people see it, ask them the question, did you behead X hundred people, whatever. And if they didn't, or so be it. If they did, great, why did you do it? What was your background? Get an understanding. Show them the compassion, because that's how the vast majority of that religious cohort will then stay with you. If you then do dastardly things to people, the vast majority of that cohort leaves you or is able to leave you. Remember, we're only talking about the talented 10. We're not talking about 90% of the people. We're talking about the people that actually get up and do something. So that's why that is extremely important to do that correctly. So in talking about terrorism, we have to understand what their goals are. And it's a political aim. Indeed, von Clausewitz said, dead simple, war is diplomacy by other means. And terrorism is exactly the same thing. Diplomacy by other means. But, as a general rule, you're not the state. That's the thing. That's the big difference. And this is also the problem with the argument saying... the original question of Hamas. It's not a state. They are not a state. Yeah, they run an authority. Gaza is an authority, but they don't control anything in that area. In reality, everything's controlled from the State of Israel, even whether they can eat or not, even whether they can watch TV, because is Israel going to switch the power on or turn it off? Even whether they can drink water. Is Israel going to turn the taps off on the water supply? Right, so it's not a state. So can you really be fighting a state, a people, if you're not fighting a state? You've got to ask yourself questions, right? So this is where we are with this whole issue. yeah, I did say that I'd speak because it behooves me to kind of explain the whole process. And I did think I'd speak about Libya because that's a fantastic example of this whole process about what is a terrorist and what isn't. And I don't think, this is me saying it, that you can call a state a terrorist state. I don't think you can. I don't think it's possible. Now, I dealt with narco-terrorism when I was on the section that dealt with Colombia. I'm going to come to Libya, don't forget, I will come to it. When I dealt with the section that came to Colombia, I dealt with narco-terrorism. Why was it called narco-terrorism? Because it was the narcotics organisations, illegal narcotics, by the way, and if we didn't have them as illegal, there would have been no problem with narcotics, but we made them illegal. That's just, again, it's like the Volstead Act and making drink illegal. All you're going to do when you make things illegal like that, you're going to have a vacuum and somebody's going to fill the vacuum. And because it's illegal, criminals will fill the vacuum. And because it's illegal, you cannot go to a court of restraint. So what happens is people fight for their peace via armaments. Right, so this is what happened in Colombia. And when the United States made a suggestion to the Colombian government that what we should do with these primary narcos, i.e. the top, when we catch them, is take them to the United States and not put them in Colombian jails, but put them in jails in the United States, supermaxes, where they're probably in solitary confinement all their life, nigh on. Then this makes the narcos think, wow, we can't have this happen. So they come together, particularly the primary individual did, at a level which was absolutely bloody in its actions. And Pablo Escobar blew up aircraft. He killed countless police, countless judges, countless soldiers, and normal people in order to basically, and politicians, in order to basically make the Colombian politicians change that law and make them once again take the money which he'd offered them and leave him with an easy life to export drugs into the United States. That's I'm cutting it very, very short, but I'm just explaining how terrorism can take different perspectives. So we call that narco-terrorism because it was undermining the state of Colombia. So let's look at what I think is probably one of the best examples at one man's changing of the perspective of what you can call terror. Because you can't call the state terror. Because as you know, when I read you out the definition, it's the unlawful. Well, if you're the state and you say an act is being done on your behalf, it cannot be unlawful. The fact that I drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima and then a couple of days later on Nagasaki, and each time I evaporate 400,000 or 500,000 civilians, right? Each time I evaporate them, I incinerate them, right? When the war is already over, cannot make me a terrorist because it's a lawful action, because I'm doing it as a soldier at the behest of the President of the United States, in this case. Okay? Now, is it a war crime? Absolutely, I'd argue. Absolutely it is. Because not only does that evaporate people on day, date, time and place, it also kills them for days, weeks, months and years afterwards. And then it creates fetuses that are born incorrectly, etc., etc., etc. Same with Agent Orange. Because the actions that I carry out there live within the bodies of the hosts, of the women in particular, who then pass on the diseases to their children. Is that terrorism? No. Because it's lawful. So he can't be a terrorist. Is it a war crime? Yes. Okay. I don't know, another example, top of my mind, is it terrorism to control a settler state? And I'll explain what I mean by that. These are the states which Europeans have taken over for themselves. So the United States example, where you basically get all of the people who lived there before, you exterminate as many as you can, yeah? And if you can't exterminate them all, you then force the others onto reservations. So there are still Indian reservations now. Native American is the terminology, where the Native American people still live on reservations. And that's all they've got left of the land. Or you could look at Australia doing the same with Aboriginals, and Aboriginals being forced into the Northern Territories and being treated like dogs there. And if you look into the Parliament today in Australia, you'll find, I think, just one Aboriginal heritage person, and those are the indigenous people of the state. They have no rights. You can go to Canada and see exactly the same. You can go to South Africa, which now, actually, strangely, the one continent where the indigenous people have been able to fight back to such a level that they now control the continent is African continent, with the exception of the northern regions. And you could say that the later coming peoples, that's hundreds of years before, millennia before, in fact, were the people from I'm loath to call them Arab peoples, because they're just mixed race people of African and Arab Semitic peoples. They're mixed race peoples who now run those northern regions. They're mixed race. They're not just one type of people, by sure. They're always Africans within them. So regardless of whether they're dark or light, they are of mixed African heritage in the north, to some extent in the south. So that continent seems to be the one where it has been able to throw off the yoke, which had been colonised, throw off the yoke of that colonisation, even though the price has been massive. So if you take the Congo, within 20 years, the Belgians had exterminated, in fact it's about 15, the Belgians had exterminated 11 million people in the Congo. Right? Was that terrorism? Because they didn't just exterminate them in that way. They actually chopped children's hands off, children's feet off. And feet, not the whole leg, just the feet, just so they could still be working. Chopped a hand off if you didn't work fast enough. Cut their mouths open. We're not talking 1600s here now. We're talking, obviously it's after the Treaty Bill end of 1884, so you're talking about 1880s, 1890s. Okay, your grandparents can be alive still. Maybe not. Just some of your grandparents have not died that long ago who were still alive in that era. Okay? So this sort of, all the way up to about I think from about 1880, 1890, through to about 1906, I think, when it's in Hansard's, where they say, we've got to stop the Belgian king doing this. He's just exterminating too many people. And it's looking bad for our own colonies in the region, because they're getting angry with what's going on. So you see what I'm saying is that terror? Of course it's terrorism. Of course it's terror, but it can't, because it's lawful, because they've taken the country over, so it's now lawful. Right? So this is where you get the problem. So hence the case study of Libya, and I'll leave it here for these 2 weeks critical thinking, because this will be part 2 of the second week, because otherwise it's going to be an extremely long episode. So let's look at Libya, shall we, as a prime example. Basically, the person we know as Colonel Gaddafi took over in Libya from King Idris, who was a king of the Libyan people. Now, what's the real message behind that? Well, the real message behind it was that King Idris had done a deal with the oil companies, which basically provided Libya, read for that, King Idris and the upper echelons of the Libyan society whom he wished to pay off, provided them with something like 25, I think it's 22% of the oil revenue. And the British Anglo-American oil companies with the rest of it. So in other words, they were just paying off the king, and then the rest of the profit from the oil came to these oil companies. So the problem was, however, was that a cadre of not necessarily highly educated in terms of the sense that they've been to university, etc., but smart individuals who'd then gone to staff colleges, and in this case with Gaddafi in Britain, Sandhurst and others, and had been educated in military ways, looked at this circumstance and said, this can't be right. Why is there an elite that paid off the religious elite as well, who were cramming in this type of money and living okay whilst the rest of the people are living very, very poorly? So when the king went out to, I'm trying to think, I think it was to Greece for some treatment, Gaddafi took over in a bloodless coup. And nobody was, as far as I'm aware, was killed within the coup. He took over, and he already had set in mind how the system should work. And I think because he'd seen the corruption in the religious sphere, he didn't want it to be religious, but he also didn't want it to be somehow communism tied to the Soviet Union or even to China, because he knew that would bring on the wrath of the United States and Britain to some extent. So therefore, he basically wanted a system which he could run that would be true and fair to all the people. And this is the case. So he called it the Third Universal Way, and he created this green book in a later stage after some years of being in rule, in power. But what is undeniable to say is that what he did with the monies that he got from the oil companies, which was his biggest mistake, but the only one he could do, frankly, was that he decided to say, this is now the new oil deal, we get 75% and you get 25%. Well, of course, that was hated by the oil companies. And as I said before, the United States in particular is basically a business state, a fiscal state. And the oil companies that have great lobbyists, etc., go into the United States Congress and Senate, and they say, listen, something's got to be done about this fella. Everybody will be copying him. We've got to sort him out. So the first action, which was with us as well, the United Kingdom, is we tried to cause a coup within Libya. It doesn't work. But what does that coup do to the Libyans? It means they now have to start calling people within Libya terrorists. And it means that they now have to start clamping down on terrorists in Libya who were willing to form another coup to overtake him. Anyway, it doesn't happen. Done. So what now the United States does with Saudi Arabia, because Libya at one stage was a very conservative state that sat with Saudi and did what Saudi did, etc., etc. But Gaddafi has changed all that, so the Saudis want rid of him. So the Yanks sit together, Americans sit together with the Saudis and then decide we're going to create a body, it's a National Front for the Salvation of Libya, but it will create itself in a way, but we're going to fund it, which is what happens. You don't need to create organisations to come against another state. What happens is you just fund those organisations, and those organisations become bigger and bigger and bigger, and you then lend them assistance. And that National Front for the Salvation of Libya then carries out actions in Libya. Now, is that a terrorist organisation? Was that deemed terrorist by the United Kingdom government? No, it wasn't. If it's carrying out terrorism in Libya, is it a terrorist organisation? Well, I guess you can argue it is. Because the state of Libya is run by Colonel Gaddafi. And Colonel Gaddafi, and that's the run Libya, that is a Libyan state. Right. So right there you have an organisation formed by the West, aided by the West, to carry actions in Libya via Chad on occasions. I won't go into the whole full history of it because you can look it up if you're interested. You can look the full history up. There's several attempts to form major coups to overtake. It does none of them work. Because at the end of the day, for the vast majority of Libyans, what Colonel Gaddafi did is something they'd never had before. They got a nice house. They got a good standard of living. Their children were becoming educated. They were sent around the world to the best universities, etc., etc. But what Gaddafi then did is, which would undermine him, and by the way, you need to understand the Libyan population isn't large, it's 2 odd million at the time, is what he did was, he said, okay, what I'm going to do now, you form a terrorist organisation against me, I'm going to form organisations against you. And basically any organisation that was terrorist in the West, or deemed terrorist in the West, was basically funded by Libya. And the organisations, his external security organisation, the equivalent to Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, and the internal security organisations, both of these organisations in Libyan intelligence service and police, they then went on a footing to look for fifth columnists, people who are inside the organisation, people who are trying to undermine them, people who are trying to cause problems for them, and therefore they basically ran a system whereby they would seek these people out, regardless of wherever they were in the world, and they intended to exterminate them. Assassinate them, you could argue. Because they're not taking everybody down, but these individuals who they thought were the primary individuals involved in it. But in addition to that, they then funded the IRA with a whole host of weaponry, because we'll teach the British, because the British are trying to form people to come against us. We'll teach the Americans a lesson by aiding people in Colombia, aiding people in Nicaragua, aiding people in El Salvador, aiding people in the United States even. So they aided the black movements in the United States. We'll teach Britain a lesson again by funding the miners' strike and giving the miners money. Millions, so they can live, because it's undermining the United Kingdom government, so let's undermine it. We'll teach the Belgians a lesson by giving the fighting cells. We'll teach the Italians a lesson, used to be the former colonial rulers of Italy, of Libya. We'll teach the Italians a lesson by supporting the Brigado Rosso, the Red Brigades. We'll teach the Germans a lesson by supporting the Rote Armee Faction and the Bader-Meinhof group. We'll obviously teach the Israelis a lesson, because we don't like them anyway, and we'll teach them a lesson by supporting any of the Palestinian liberation organisations. So, Libya cannot be a terrorist because it's doing something lawful, as is perceived. But of course, all the organisations that it's aiding can all be deemed as terrorists. Or can they? So this is what we come back to our original concept, because of course they funded the Encontro Sizwe, and they funded the ANC. Libya supported the fighters in Mozambique fighting against the Portuguese who had occupied that area. In Angola, they supported the ones in Angola. They supported SWAPO in southwest, which is now Namibia, in southwest Africa. They supported those fighting against Rhodesian oppressors. And therefore, all of the organisations that they supported around the world would have been, at some way, shape or means, deemed as terrorists by the country in which these organisations were fighting. So hence, Libya becomes the arch number one terrorist supporter. Now, if I spin that the other way around, and I can tell you that the United States was supporting any organisation that basically undermined the Soviet Union in any way, shape or means, is then the United States the number one terrorist supporter. This is, the fact that, actually, that the United States, let's take something very, very close, the United States supported the actions in Jamaica even, by supporting the Sayaga. There are two factions fighting for power in Jamaica. Manley, who had shown some sort of interest about how Cuba was being run. And then you had Sayaga, who was more orientated, the sons of the white planter classes, who were more orientated to the United States. Now the CIA was supporting Sayaga, bringing guns into Jamaica in order to make sure Jamaica didn't fall to the Cubans as they perceived it, or the Cuban-orientated Michael Manley, who was, these are two guys who became prime ministers of Jamaica and their actions. Even though Jamaica should have been under the influence of the British, the Americans were playing within there, the CIA in particular. And I've no doubt that some of that may have been worked with ourselves. So you see, this is why it becomes quite a difficult scenario about who is and who isn't a terrorist. And I'm going to leave you with this one. Having worked a hell of a lot in Palestine and the Palestinian area and in Israel, I will say to you simply that the Netanyahu government supported Hamas monetarily and possibly also intelligence-wise. Whether the Hamas knew they were getting that from the Israelis is questionable. But this is the point. So again, I better answer the question which you're all asking now. Why? Why would Bibi Netanyahu support Hamas? Dead simple. If you don't want a united Palestinian front with all Palestinians working together, which is what the PLO kind of created from a whole host of disparate groups, with the exception of Fatah the Revolutionary Council, which people might know better as the Abu Nidal group. Basically, at one stage, Arafat was able to bring most of the Palestinian groups together under the single auspices of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. I say disparate organisations, all of them nigh on called terrorists in the past. Absolutely called terrorists by the Israelis and some by the other states. Now, what you've also got to realise, of course, that when Israel knows the way this is played, because when Israel was formed as a state, it had the Stern Gang, it had the Agum, it had, and these were groups carrying out terrorist actions against the British rulers of Palestine under the mandate. So if you remember the St. David Hotel, I'm not going to go into it, you can look at it, St. David's Hotel, you remember that soldiers and police, British soldiers, British police were being executed, hung up on olive trees, etc., by Zionist organisations who were deemed by the British as terrorists after the Second World War, 45, 46, 47, deemed as terrorists. They finally blew up the St. David Hotel in which the British administration was and killed a whole load of Brits in there and others. This was all aimed at getting a state of Israel. And of course, Ben-Gurion, one of the leaders, was also part of these terrorist organisations. Was it a terrorist organisation? There you go again, depends on where you are. But to the Brits, it was terrorist. So we deemed them terrorists. At the very start of the State of Israel, with one of its very first presidents, terrorists. So why would Netanyahu do it? Because he knows that's the way the book's played. So, because what you can't have is all the units coming together. So what you want to do is split them up. So you want the West Bank split from Gaza. You want that for two simple reasons. One, it says to the rest of the world, indeed he just points this out, he'll just say, listen, they can't even get on with each other. They're fighting each other. I was there on the very day in Gaza when Fatah, which is the PLO's organisation, was thrown out in conflict, in battle, thrown out by Hamas. I was there on that day. Okay? That's good for Israel, very good, because that shows you that they're fighting each other. So when people say, well, let's give the Palestinians that, I say, well, they're not even sure who they're fighting themselves. They fight each other themselves, right? Boom, number one. Number two is that when you're dealing with a divide and rule situation, we were good at that in the past, but divide and rule situation, you're going to get better deals from the divided individuals. Because the divided individuals need your support and assistance in order to perform. Whereas if you become one block, one powerful block, you can work much easier. You don't want a mass of people coming together collectively. So hence, that's why Hamas was good. I repeat, very good for people who think like DD, where you don't want an end to conflict. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that this has been insightful, that you have some idea about what might or might not be a terrorist. But in the end, let's be realistic, it's personal. It'll be whatever you think it is. But all I'm trying to do, or I've tried to do in these 2 episodes, is to give you an understanding of why it isn't simplistic, of why you will have to really think when you're putting those processes forward, and then basically stand on the position that you stand on. And there might be a whole load of complex reasons why you come to a particular a decision and reasoning and understanding, or there might not be. But what I want and always try to do with these critical thinking subjects is to at least make you think about it before you fall down on the side of whatever, and you just don't listen to some person espousing something which 9 times out of 10 in the media, some journal who has no real understanding of the conflict, or has an agenda, or is bought and paid for. So it's all about you, yourself, doing the legwork, doing the mind work, making the understanding, not listening to me, not listening to Piers Morgan, actually finding your own level by trying to get the information. And yes, I know what you're going to say. There's a lot of fake news out there. There's a lot of people saying a lot of things, but just read the histories, just read the understanding, just get a feel for what it is. Just think in the past how things functioned. Just think how they function now. Just actually try and do some deliberation. That's all I ask of people in my critical thinking. Do some deliberation and understand where this world is. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much, and hopefully you'll listen to me again, and probably also, Fergus, next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
More than a quarter of a century, I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.